I actually don't have a copy of my own book, so I'm going to be working off of my copy on Kindle.
It's completely fine. You can also borrow mine if you want.
All right. I'm on now. Yeah, I am on. You want me to turn it off? I'm on.
Not necessarily. Just don't say anything like super embarrassing.
Okay, sure. And, I'm okay with starting in what, about 5 minutes?
As soon as the...
If I go to the bathroom, I'll let you know. Please shut them off at that moment. I would definitely need that to be shut off. Yeah. Okay. You want to? Okay. Sure. All right. We can actually talk. We don't have to pretend.
So you said you have a copy of your book on
I have it on here, and I'm assuming we're not like doing exegetical reading.
No, it's going to be. I just used the questions that we talked about
Yeah,
today.
perfect.
Okay.
Perfect. Yeah, I don't know if we'll get to all.
Yep, that's
all the questions,
fine.
but yeah.
Yeah, sorry that I had so many.
No, those are great.
I think they probably filled you in on this, but it'll just be about a half hour of
Sure.
our conversation, and then we'll open it up for the
Sounds good.
audience.
Sounds good. Yeah. Let me actually pull this
How
up.
many days of the week do you travel?
Well, this has been a pretty intense 10 days. I think it's my 7th day away in 10 days. So. I'm assuming I'm on. I didn't say anything inappropriate. Yeah, it's in the back of my. Is that the bio?
Yes. Is that okay to?
Yeah, you know what? There actually, when it was read earlier, there might have been a few corrections. Yeah. I got promoted. Let me turn this. And I did get my. This is kind of an older one. I did finish my PhD. Yeah, there's a couple of bios online that I just never check on, and my bio on my webpage, which went defunct many years ago, people still refer to it, but it's dated. Yeah.
Hello, hello. Sorry to interrupt some of you yet again. Welcome, everyone. My name is Rusty Hawkins. I'm the Associate Dean of the John Wesley Honors College here. And for those of you from the community, from outside the Honors College or from outside of Indiana Wesleyan University, it's my honor to welcome you here to the Globe Theater at the Student Center here at Indiana Wesleyan, where we're going to have a great conversation tonight, a public conversation with Dr. Raw. That's going to be hosted by Dr. Lanta Davis, who's an Associate Professor of Humanities and Literature in the Honors College. I'm going to let Dr. Davis introduce Dr. Raw more fully, but just wanted to go over some logistics of the evening with you before we get started. If you would, do me the favor right now of reaching into your pockets and making sure those cell phones that you have are silenced. That would be great. I'll do the same thing. And maybe if you want to even be like really radical tonight, you can just even power it down for the next hour so it's not distracting you. This buzzing, the constant buzzing. I want to give you just a heads up about what to expect tonight. So we're gonna take about the next hour to have a conversation with Dr. Raw about his book. The first half of that hour, so the first 30 minutes or so, are going to be Dr. Davis asking questions to Dr. Raw, and then we're going to transition into a time of question and answer with the audience. And this is an opportunity for the students here who have read the book to ask Dr. Raw a question. So some of you who are not, this isn't your first time here, may remember years ago when we had the television studio here, WIW would televise this, and there was all this pressure in the room, and there's this deep-seated angst in the atmosphere because there are these producers that would grab you and throw you up to a microphone. I want you to have that same angst tonight. Because we are recording this, and we will be putting this up on our website, and we do want to show the world that later watches this that we have intelligent and inquisitive students among us who are eager, in fact, to ask questions. So Dr. Davis, when she's wrapping up her portion of the conversation, will give some indication that the time is coming for you to ask questions. We have two microphones, as convenient as we can be for you tonight. There's a microphone over here and a microphone over here. We're going to ask that you go ahead and just queue up at those microphones and ask your questions for Dr. Raw. Dr. Riggs is sitting back here as a bouncer, and if no one gets up to those microphones, he will be the enforcer tonight. So let's not have that go down. And let me turn things over now to Dr. Davis.
Welcome, everybody. I get the pleasure to introduce our guest for the day. Dr. Soong Raw is Milton B. Engertson Professor of Church Growth and Evangelism at North Park Theological Seminary in Chicago, Illinois, and the author of The Next Evangelicalism, Freeing the Church from Western Cultural Captivity, and most recently, Many Colors, Cultural Intelligence for a Changing Church, and even more recently, Prophetic Lament, the book that we will be discussing tonight. His classes enable students to identify the skills necessary for practicing sociology, cultural analysis, expanding their understanding of the relationship between the church and the urban setting. As an ordained minister of the Evangelical Covenant Church, Dr. Ra has seen firsthand the denomination's significant growth in urban areas and an increasing need for intercultural ministry. He was founding senior pastor of Cambridge Community Fellowship Church, Cambridge, Massachusetts, a multi-ethnic, urban ministry-focused church committed to living out the values of racial reconciliation and social justice in the urban context. Dr. Ra received his BA in Political Science and History Sociology from Columbia, his MDiv from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, his Master's in Theology from Harvard, his Doctorate of Ministry from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and his Doctorate in Theology from Duke University. So please join me in welcoming him with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so I'd just like to start off by having you maybe fill in a few of us who haven't had the chance yet to read your book. Can you just start out with telling us why it's so important for the American church to recover their practice of lament?
It's a great question for those of you who didn't read the book. Don't raise your hands. It came from some background work that I was doing in terms of the worship life of the church. So the far background is that when I was a church planner in 1996, we were starting a church that was in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I was drawing from Harvard students and MIT students, or as they like to call themselves, the modern and postmodern together. So we had Harvard students and MIT students kind of in this community who were very privileged because of their standing in society, because of where they were in terms of their education. And realizing that when we started the church, we wanted to be an intentionally urban ministry-focused church, that these individuals who had incredible educations and privilege in these higher education institutions really didn't know how to relate well to places of suffering. Cambridge is actually, aside from MIT and Harvard, a very urban location. Where we planted our church was called Central Square, and many of the MIT students called it Central Scare, because it was the scary neighborhood. It was where the hood was in our neighborhood. And so there was a little bit of an anxiety by MIT and Harvard students to engage the urban context. And I realized as we were starting the church that there was a theological gap for many who didn't know how to engage places of suffering, places like urban contexts. And so the very first sermon series that I preached at our new church plant was on the Book of Lamentations, which is, I teach church planting now. I would say, please don't do that, because it just is not, a seeker-sensitive, attractional model type of thing to do. But the intention of that was recognizing that those very privileged, very well-educated, successful individuals who were at MIT and Harvard really needed another narrative to engage with. And what I was finding was that the church in America was just horrible at themes of lament and narratives of suffering. One of the studies that I cite is by Denise Hopkins, who teaches at Wesleyan Seminary in Washington, D.C., and she was noting that the liturgical traditions, even though they are guided towards lament psalms and hymns, oftentimes they will skip those lament psalms and hymns and replace them with happier psalms and happier hymns because they were avoiding the pain and suffering that was evident in things like lament. Glenn Pemberton's work looking at Baptist and Presbyterian hymnals, noting that of the 150 psalms we have in the Bible, 60% are psalms of celebration and praise, but 40% of our psalms are psalms of suffering and lament. But if you look at a typical Baptist Presbyterian hymnal, about 15 to 20% of our hymns are considered lament. And that's just what's in there. That's not what's even typically sung. It just means that we are over-representing praise and celebration and under-representing hymns of lament over suffering. I did my own study, and I looked at the CCLI licensing list. Some of you might know what this list is. If you ever led contemporary worship and you project worship songs on the screen, you're supposed to have a little number at the bottom that represents you have licensed with CCLI to project contemporary worship songs. It's not published elsewhere in a hymnal. So after you do that, you're supposed to call them or write to them or email them, carrier pigeon, I don't know. You're supposed to let them know what songs that you sang in your church that Sunday. So they actually have a very accurate list of of the typical songs that are sung in a contemporary worship service. And they publish that list every year, the top 100 most popular worship songs. So I went through every song. Actually, my TA went through every song. I did too. We went through every song, every lyric, every title of the top 100 most popular worship songs to try to find lament songs in our contemporary worship. And how many of you say, just like in the Bible, 40% of our contemporary worship are lament psalms? You're deluded. Sorry, I mean, you're you're wrong. How many say 25% of our contemporary worship are songs of lament? Is it 20%? Is it 15%? Is it 10%? It's somewhere between 5 and 10, I would identify our contemporary worship popular songs fall into the genre of lament. And that's using the word lament as generously as I possibly can. The words are, I cry out. Yes, lament. Rest of the words are, I cry out for joy. No, I'm still counting it, still have to count it. So there is an absence of lament in the worship life, the prayer life, the teaching life. In a gathering like this, I won't do it now, but I usually ask, how many of you have ever heard an entire sermon series on the Book of Lamentations? And one, maybe two people will raise their hands. And I'll talk about that one positive verse in chapter 3. I'm talking about the entire book. And so very few of us have, because our narrative of celebration does not leave room for lament. And Brueggemann asked the question that I'm kind of trying to address here as well. What happens when lament is lost as a discipline in the church? What are we missing? One, we don't engage justice very well, because we don't understand injustice, so we don't know how to engage justice, because the narrative of injustice and suffering is missing. And the other part of it is we're actually creating a theological famine for ourselves by not engaging in the full canon of Scripture. And the kind of the chicken and eggs issue was the triumphalism and exceptionalism that is so prevalent in the American church now, that is clearly an offshoot or a product of the triumphalism and exceptionalism in American society. That has led to the absence of lament. And the absence of lament has led to the exasperation of the absence, the furthering of triumphalism and exceptionalism. And so we have these dysfunctional narratives in our society and in the church, triumphalism and exceptionalism. These are not biblical concepts. These are dysfunctional cultural narratives. And we can't address that because we don't know how to offer an alternative spiritual practice like lament.
Great. Yes, you mentioned that one of our difficulties is figuring out how to engage questions of justice, and that we, in your book, talk about how we've abstracted injustice and don't have this kind of personal sense of culpability. So for instance, if I consider a question like human trafficking, I just hear about it, I decide I want to go out and help, so I immediately book a mission trip to go save workers. What am I kind of missing from this equation?
Yeah, that's an important question, because it's very contemporarily relevant, because what we're seeing now in many areas is a revisiting towards some of these concepts of justice. We're seeing it particularly among millennials, Gen Z, who are saying we want to re-engage a narrative that for many in the evangelical church was kind of a lost season, where previous generations ignored justice issues. So I would actually, in a positive way, affirm that desire to return to an engagement with social justice issues that I think a younger generation in particular wants to do. My concern is that without lament as part of that justice pursuit, we're going to end up with kind of to put it in very stark terms, the white messiah complex, where those of us who have some of the privileges that come from being Western or North American Christians believe that we are going to go out and save the world with our education, with our knowledge, with our know-how, with our money. And what it does is it allows us to have an abstracted, distant relationship with justice. So one of the things I talk about, that lament has multiple genres. Within this genre of lament is subgenres. And one of those subgenres is the distinction between a corporate lament and a personal lament. And both are necessary. What happens is that oftentimes we make such a dichotomizing perspective in corporate and personal that we don't see the interaction between the two. So for example, it is much easier to say we're going to go and fight poverty, but you can do nothing about it and still feel like you're fighting poverty. You can like something on Facebook and fight poverty. You can retweet something and like confronting injustice. So that kind of abstraction allows us to engage in something as profound as justice on a very superficial level. Now, if you move that injustice abstraction to a personal reality and say, I don't just want to deal with poverty as an abstract idea. I want to deal with my neighbor and my friend Mike, who is poor. I want to deal with my friend Janet, who's homeless. I don't want to just deal with the injustice of sexual trafficking. I want to address the sin that is imparted upon this particular individual. So justice should have an abstract reality, philosophical reality to it, but it is also very important that justice has a very real face to it. And what lament does is that one of the more powerful things about lament for me is that it allows more for the voices of the marginalized rather than the privileged. So a lot of our abstracted justice that you're alluding to is when the privileged dictate the terms of how justice is going to be dealt with, right? When the privilege from our abstracted realities, from our ivory towers, from our positions of privilege and wealth and affluence, make the decision that we're going to go and save the world out of that abstract idea of justice. That's North American privilege, to be able to pontificate on the realities of justice. If we are really engaging in the depth of lament, we have to hear the voice of the marginalized. We have to hear and know the stories of the broken and the suffering. The way I outline in the Book of Lamentations is deals with authorship. Who wrote the Book of Lamentations? Traditionally, it's been credited to Jeremiah, mainly because of the exile that necessitates the writing of Lamentations. Most of the literate and most of those who were candidates to write a book like Lamentations would have been sent away into exile. In fact, there was maybe one, maybe a few others, but really the one that we know of who could read or write and who had the capacity to write a book like Lamentations would have been Jeremiah. But when people look at the Book of Lamentations and look at the Book of Jeremiah, they realize it's very different styles of writing. So I use the illustration, it's like Shakespeare and Tupac. Both are great poets, probably not the same person if you're reading both of them side by side. That's how distinct Jeremiah's writing is from the Book of Lamentations. So what's happening then if Jeremiah is the only candidate? So my argument is that Jeremiah goes to the city gate, which is the town court, essentially, town square, and he listens to the voices of those that have been hurt the most in that society. Specifically, widows, orphans, the sick, the lame, the blind, the crippled, those marginalized in that society. So Jeremiah, who is the person of ultimate privilege, sets aside his privilege so that his story is not front and center, but the story of the suffering comes front and center. So when we abstract justice, we are taking that position of privilege to try to define injustice and justice on our terms, in the philosophical, theological, abstracted terms that we love to talk about in places like this. But when you get out of the way to make room for the marginalized voices, now injustice, the fall of Jerusalem, the suffering of the women, the suffering of the widows and the orphans, that has a real face to it. And that's what I think in the 21st century, many of us who are talking about justice have failed to recognize how personal justice needs to be, rather than this kind of abstracted ideal that privileged people can talk about.
How do we we recognize then to our own individual role in these kind of collective, larger structures of sin?
Yeah, that's a great question. And not just because you told me you were going to ask me that earlier, but it's just a great question. This is where kind of the individual and the corporate pieces of it come in for me, the individual lament versus the corporate lament. Corporate lament is oftentimes lost in the church. And I wrote about this in one of my earlier books, that American culture is so wrapped up in this hyper-individualism. We don't know how to deal with corporate structural problems. My provost, Michael Emerson, and Christian Smith did a phenomenal work on this, on the issue of race, to say that the categories of trying to deal with race among white evangelicals differs vastly from African American Christians, mainly because white evangelicals see the issue of race purely through an individualistic lens, whereas African American Christians see it through more of a corporate, structural, systemic lens. And so because of that, there are tendencies, I think, within particular communities to see these social justice problems through these particular lenses. And I think one of the things that, again, lament does is it gets us out of these places of comfort where we are only talking to each other and affirming our unique particular cultural positions to hear the marginalized voices. So that's why sometimes when we talk about race issues, to be blunt, I don't know if I want to hear another white male evangelical explain to me what race is. I just don't know if that's productive. What I would love to hear is the voice of the marginalized who have a different perspective on race because their experience is different. And that's what lament offers, the opportunity for voices to be heard that we typically would not hear in the echo chambers that we tend to live in.
You also mentioned that consumerism is such that it manages to kind of absorb anything in its wake. So how do we kind of figure out how to engage with these questions of injustice without falling into consumeristic traps and products of interacting?
That's again, a great question that you asked me earlier that I thought about over the afternoon. Sorry. I'm looking at, one of the examples that I give in the book is how attempts at remedying and rectifying injustice oftentimes ends up kind of collapsing on itself and not being productive, being counterproductive, because it still perpetuates the unjust systems. And consumerism, a classic example of that. So the example that I use is the Red campaign that was launched with much fanfare about 10 years ago. Do y'all remember this? It was a Super Bowl commercial which cost about $2 million. And of course Bono was on it, and Brad Pitt, and Tom Hanks, and all these A-list celebrity, Angelina Jolie, all these A-list celebrities are on there talking about the launch of the Red campaign. Anybody remember what the campaign was for? It was to address the problem of HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. And they were trying to raise funds to address the issue of sub-Saharan Africa AIDS pandemic. They spent $10 million on this ad campaign to raise awareness and to raise funds for AIDS relief in sub-Saharan Africa. Advertising Weekly, which tracked this, noted that after 10 years of this campaign, how much money do you think was raised? $10 million. So they made no money. They spent $10 million, they made $10 million. They made no money for sub-Saharan Africa AIDS relief. But who did make the money during that time? Because what was the Red campaign? You're supposed to buy a red iPod. You're supposed to buy red products at Target. You're supposed to buy jeans from Levi's. And through your consumerism, you were supposed to address the problem of AIDS in sub-Saharan, HIV/AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa. What it was trying to do was address an injustice with the same methodology of that injustice, right? So what is the injustice of the HIV/AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa? Is it the absence of medication and more money needed to research medication? I would argue that it's not. And I'll tell you this through a story. when I was in seminary, my friends and I would go to the nearby Chili's because they had 50-cent fajitas. And so we would go there, and we'd eat 50-cent fajitas, and we would watch the local news. And one night we're eating our fajitas, and we see on the news, Magic Johnson comes on TV. Some of you remember this, some of you weren't born. Magic Johnson, a great basketball player, if you don't know, comes on TV and announces that he has HIV/AIDS. And it's a huge deal because he was at the height of his career. He was supposed to play in the Olympics. It was a big national splash. Now, those of you who remember that press conference, and you remember where you were, what was your first thought of what's going to happen to Magic? He's dead. Yeah. It won't be long now. Maybe a month, maybe a week. Magic's dead. This was about 25 years ago. Anybody seen Magic Johnson lately? He's looking really healthy. Kind of looks chunky, actually. He's looking really healthy why? Because we have effectively, to some extent, cured HIV/AIDS. There's no vaccine for it, but someone could live for 25 years with the HIV/AIDS virus if you have the money and the health insurance company that Magic Johnson has. But if you are living in sub-Saharan Africa, the cost of medication is prohibitive, and so you won't get that. So the problem of HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa is not a cure. It's not medication that is absent. It's there. The problem is the greed of the pharmaceutical companies that want to charge sub-Saharan Africa the same that they charge Magic Johnson Insurance Company. That's the sin that's causing this horrible, horrible rampant disease to continue almost unabated. It is not a missing cure. It is a missing will to confront the pharmaceutical companies that won't share these medications at a more affordable price. In other words, the problem of HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa is rooted in a materialism and consumerism of the pharmaceutical companies. So there's no way we're going to combat that materialism with more materialism. How do you combat a social dysfunctional reality of the pandemic of HIV/AIDS, which is rooted in an excessive greed and materialism, by getting people to buy more products? That's where some of that disconnect is, and that goes back again. If you abstract justice enough, and you don't have that personal, real-life relationship with those who lament, a community of lament, then you can make justice whatever you want it to be, and you can make your attempts at addressing justice whatever you want it to be. And that's where some of that disconnect is, where we are unable to address injustices in the world because we don't really know and have that connection through lament what injustice is.
So one of my questions, too, has to deal with that place of just knowing. Is there a sense in which space makes a big difference? So what might prophetic lament look like in different places? Are there some places where you just have to move, such as the suburbs, into the city to be able to better understand? Or how would it work in a smaller city like ours? Yeah,
so that's a good question. Mainly because I've lived most of my life in urban settings. I grew up in inner city Baltimore, as I joke. I grew up in a rough neighborhood in Baltimore, which is redundant. So I grew up in an inner city neighborhood in Baltimore. I've lived in New York. I've lived in Boston. I live now in Chicago. So most of my life experience and what I write about tends to be stories from urban life. I left some parts of my life in the suburbs, but I'm realizing that there are different life experiences that occur because of our geography. And my caution usually is that don't assume this is now a card or a permission to move into urban neighborhoods because, hey, you want to experience lament. No, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is, are there places where we encounter lament in all shapes and sizes and forms within our communities? So maybe one kind of quick example of this is the diversity that is already here in America is no longer merely an urban phenomenon. It is rural, suburban, urban. A few years ago, there was a raid of a company that had hired a significant number of undocumented immigrants. It was a huge national news. That was not in Chicago. It was not even in a suburb of Chicago. It was in a small town in Iowa. So the diversity that we're talking about is much more widespread. The problem is, even in small towns, if there is that diversity, we disengage from it. We don't want to have anything to do with it. So it's not that it's not there, it's just that we have made a conscious decision to either ignore it or not connect to it. So is there a place for people to move geographically from one location? Absolutely, there is that place. But if we are looking for places where we can address injustice, it's not simply moving to a place where that you think is there, it's also being very much aware of the injustice right in your community. The other part of that is what I kind of have been thinking through more about advocacy. The truth is that I've been invited to a lot of different places to speak. But there are some places that won't invite me because I'm an angry Asian person. Or at least that's my persona that I've been told. I'm not. I'm really a nice guy, but I've been told I'm an angry Asian guy. So some places I won't be able to speak to. Maybe some small towns or suburban communities that will either disinvite me or not invite me. But many of you can go there. In fact, many of you will be pastors there. Many of you will be youth pastors there. And sure, you can invite me to come and yell at white folks. That's how I make my living. I'm happy to do it. But at the end of the day, I could be very easily forgotten once I'm there and the next week I'm gone. But these are your aunts and your uncles. These are your grandmas and your grandpas. And they're going to listen to you more than they're going to listen to me. And that's where some of that geography is not simply, saying, hey, let's find all the poor people in our neighborhood and help them. That's part of it. But that's also preparing grandma and grandpa. Grandma and grandpa, you got to get ready because folks are moving into our neighborhood that you didn't know. Grandma and grandpa, you got to get ready because America's not that great anymore. We got to deal with that reality. So these are conversations that you can have that I probably cannot have. And so some of that geography means, is there a way that you can be prophetic and pastoral to your community that many of us, maybe not, some of us might not be able to reach?
So I'm just going to ask one final brief question. You end your book with talking about Bonhoeffer. I'm just kind of curious how his life and work provides a helpful context for understanding this life of lament.
Yeah, I mean, Bonhoeffer was such a great study for me. So I've had the privilege of studying with and working with two brilliant Bonhoeffer, three folks. Charles Marsh is a good friend at UVA. If you have not read his biography on Bonhoeffer, please get that book. Don't get the taxes. Get Marsh's book. Charles Marsh is the book you want to get on Bonhoeffer. If you need to get a second book, get Reggie Williams' book, Black Jesus, Bonhoeffer and Black Jesus. And I've had a chance to befriend and know Reggie as well as Charles Marsh. And also, I took a Bonhoeffer course at Duke with J. Cameron Carter. So the reading of Bonhoeffer is very, very, very interesting. J. Carter, he was one of the best books on race, was written by Jay. He talks about how he went to Dallas Seminary, then he went to Southern Methodist University, then he went to UVA. And so we're talking about three very different places to study religion. Fundamentalist, Baptist, Dallas Seminary, more mainline Methodist school, and then UVA, which is actually a state school, but they have a very strong religion department. And he said every one of those schools loved Bonhoeffer. So it didn't matter whether you were a fundamentalist evangelical or a mainline Methodist or a secular religion professor, you loved Bonhoeffer. So that's where I'm seeing kind of a common thread within Christianity, religious studies in general, of we all love Bonhoeffer. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to kind of use Bonhoeffer as kind of our touchstone for our conversations. And so Reggie Williams' work is, again, phenomenal about how central his transatlantic journey journey, and especially his time in New York City, was so formative of Bonhoeffer's theology and eventually his resistance to Nazi Germany. So there's some evidence that early on in Bonhoeffer's life, as a child, and you kind of understand this, you're a child growing up in World War I, and you're a child growing up in a time period where German power is completely shattered. You can imagine anybody growing up in that context, growing up with this type of nationalism. And that's what Hitler preys on. He preys upon this nationalism, this nostalgia, make Germany great again. All of that narrative is coming into play. And so Bonhoeffer is actually steeped in that. That's his reality. That's his world. But what makes him break out of that? And what people forget about Bonhoeffer is that he was coming from kind of an elite family. His father was a professor at the University of Berlin. His mother's father, his maternal grandfather, was a member of the court of Kaiser as a chaplain. So we're talking about a family that was kind of the intellectual elite of Germany at that time. And so to buy into that German nationalism would have been a very easy thing for Bonhoeffer. The question that I was asking, and Reggie Williams is asking, as well as Charles Marsh, what they're asking is, what changed for him that changes the way he starts viewing himself, his identity as a German nationalist, all of these things change, and one of the key moments is when he comes to the United States. He goes to Union Seminary, and he joins Abyssinian Baptist Church. He joins an African-American church, a historic black church, where Adam Clayton Powell is the pastor, and there's substantial evidence, I forgot the author of this book, who notes that Adam Powell probably used the phrase cheap grace before Bonhoeffer writes about it. So it's possible that Bonhoeffer took that phrase from an African-American preacher. So one of the things we looked at was the reading list that Bonhoeffer would have read during that time. Union Seminary, as many of you know, is in Harlem, so is Abyssinian Baptist Church. He would have been part of the culture of the Harlem Renaissance around that time. He actually makes a journey down towards the southern part of the United States, comes to Howard University, where he encounters the Harlem Renaissance as well, kind of black intellectuals. So what he's encountering is an African-American narrative of lament that he sees eventually as the more appropriate response to suffering than the nationalism that Adolf Hitler will eventually advocate for. So when you look at Germany prior to the rise of Adolf Hitler, they are a defeated people. They lost 40% of their young men were killed in World War I. Half of their economy is their entire economy is laid to ruins. So the idea of a suffering people, you could actually say, this is Germany, post-World War I, pre-World War II. These are a suffering people. And what Bonhoeffer was offered in his transatlantic journey was a chance to see a suffering people who, instead of turning towards triumphalism and exceptionalism, which is what Germans turned to eventually, turn towards lament. And so the lament that he experiences when he encounters African-American churches in the U.S. is the framework that he brings back to Nazi Germany, and it's very well documented. He took a whole stack of black gospel albums, and he would begin his classes with playing as an opening devotional. He would play black gospel songs. He writes to his brother-in-law that this is where I've truly become a Christian, when he writes about his experience in New York at Abyssinian Baptist Church. So that, to me, is just a beautiful example of the corrective medicine of lament. We have an individual who very easily, for a number of different social reality reasons, could have very easily slipped into the oppression of Nazi Germany. In fact, when I was doing research on this, one of the most devastating moments I had was when I found out that Kittel was a member of the Nazi Party. Some of you who have seminary studies, Kittel is the volume of New Testament word studies that you save up for in seminary. It costs about $300 $300 when I was in seminary. I saved months and months to get the Kittel volumes, and then as I'm reading through, find out that he was a member of the Nazi Party. There are pictures of these German theologians who shaved their mustaches to look like Adolf Hitler. It's devastating. There's a picture of these German pastors in their robes with the cross next to an SS officer doing the Hitler salute. Devastating. Could Bonhoeffer have gone down that route? It's possible. But what he does is he encounters the corrective of lament and actually gives voice to the suffering. And that's why he advocates for the Jewish people and stands against the German government.
All right, well, it's time to open up the conversation to members of the audience. So if you have a question for Dr. Ra, please feel free to go to one of the mics.
Hi, Dr. Ra.
Hi.
I want to thank you for coming. It's been an absolute pleasure to listen to you speak and to hear not only the vast knowledge that you have and what we might expect from someone with as many prestigious degrees as you have, but just insight and wisdom as well. So
you.
this has been drinking from a fire hose, and it's been a pleasure.
He gets an A? Is it? Can we write that down?
The question that I have is, I'd like you to help resolve maybe some sort of paradox that I'm sensing. So on the one hand, we definitely see, or I definitely see what you're talking about in our culture today, where we have a tendency to abstract justice and in a sense depersonalize it.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, we're a very individualistic culture where corporate lament or corporate actions at all make a little bit less sense to us.
Yeah.
It seems to me, or at least my first thought, is that in order to make something personal, you need to individualize it somewhat.
Good.
So can you please talk about how we can engage in corporate lament or corporate acts generally and also avoid the abstraction, whether it's with justice or suffering or anything related to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I go back to the combination of individual lament and corporate lament. And Jeremiah, if he's the curator of this material, is a great example as well. That his goal is not to philosophize about justice or injustice. His goal is to make sure that the voices are heard. And that's what happens, by the way, in Lamentations 5. A very clear move in Lamentations 5 to make sure that the voices of the suffering are heard. It is a tricky line to balance, especially with kind of the hyper-individualism in American society, to make everything into it's all about you. But that's where the individualization or individual perspective is not about you, the individual, but can you personalize it with another individual? So the type of individualism, hyper-individualism you're talking about, the emphasis is on you, the individual. Can you change that to see, yes, there's an abstract philosophical injustice in place, but I'm seeing it in a very personal way in that individual. Not me, but in another person. That's the step that I think we oftentimes don't get to. So I'm going to be a shill and promote my latest book. I just finished a book last year called Return to Justice, and it's a history book looking at 6 snapshots, along with Gary Vanderpool, my co-author, and I were looking at 6 snapshots of ways that evangelicals have engaged justice over the last 50 years. We look at World Vision, we look at CCDA, we look at Black evangelicals, Latino theologians, just to say to young people, y'all didn't discover justice, it's been around for a while, and there have been a lot of good folks who have been doing it. But one of the chapters we look at is what John Perkins and World Vision did well, which is to take an abstract concept of justice and make it very personal, make it very real, so that it's not just poverty in Africa. There's one child that, now what World Vision did even better than that was not leave it at just that one child. To say, okay, your $30 will buy 30 bottles of water. No, it won't. It will go towards a larger pool so that a well can be dug, so that that child will get clean water, but it will also bring water to the whole village. But you need to see that individual face in order to stir compassion, mercy, justice towards that community. So what World Vision did well was actually, and this is maybe a tale for us as well, is to transition from a U.S.-based relief agency to much more of an international federated model of relief, which means that the big decisions on what happens is no longer made by some random guy in Monrovia, California. It's now made by random people throughout the world. But those who are in those communities make these decisions. So what World Vision did right was to realize that justice, if it's abstracted, is too big. You can't deal with it. But when you move it into the personal, and John Perkins did this well, telling stories of individuals who were telling his personal story about how he was a victim of racial injustice and racial violence. Those personal stories oftentimes spark those of us who are more individually minded. But if it stops there, that's where I get concerned. So it should move from the abstract to the real and the concrete, but the real and the concrete should also move to the corporate. And the corporate can be real and concrete as well. So you're raising the right questions of how do we effectively communicate the injustice in the world, and one of those is to make that a personal issue. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Ra. Thank you so much for coming. It's been an absolute wonderful time learning from your book and tonight. My question comes from the chapter about the funeral dirge. You reference a rush toward a description of an America that is now post-racial. In what ways do you see society rushing towards post-racial America now? And what are some of the negative impacts of this rush?
Yeah, so I do what I tell myself never to do this afternoon. A good friend of mine wrote an article for CT or for a Christian journal or blog or something, and it was about race. And I do what I shouldn't do, which is read the comments. And I felt the freedom to do that because it wasn't my article, it was my friend's article. But man, are those comments discouraging. Because the problems show up so vividly. And those comments, which are trying to assert a post-racial America, is the proof of why we are not in a post-racial America. Because the very justification or explanation of why we live in a post-racial America demonstrates an ignorance of the reality of a racialized America. So that's kind of the tension that I'm dealing with. So I don't know if I mentioned in this book, I know I have it in another book about, as I work with multi-ethnic churches, I'm seeing two threads emerge. Multi-ethnic churches that talk about racial reconciliation and justice, and multi-ethnic churches that talk about color blindness. And so those who are post-racial America minded believe that churches should be colorblind. Now, my problem with that is that if you ever saw the movie Little Miss Sunshine, it's about a little girl who wants to go to a pageant. The most devastating moment is actually her brother's story. Her brother is a teenager who wants to study to be a fighter pilot, and he takes a vow of silence for a year so he can show the discipline of being a fighter pilot. Halfway through the movie, I'm giving it away, he finds out that he's colorblind. He has a disability, and there's things he can't do because he's colorblind. What I don't understand is why the American church insists on everybody having the same disability. And it's not a theology of disability, that's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is we're imposing a disability on the church and saying this is right. And I don't get that, because being colorblind prevents us from seeing certain realities. And that's why I'm saying the post-racial America idea is a reflection of colorblindness, which is a disability, not an ability. And so that's why there's kind of a struggle to identify a post-racial America, because those who make the argument of post-racial America oftentimes are showing why we're not in a post-racial America.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here to talk with us, Dr. Ra. My question comes from the instances in the book where you contrast a theology of celebration with a theology of suffering.
Yeah.
And when I think about a theology of celebration, people talking about the victory of the gospel and the hope of the gospel and believing in the message of the New Testament.
Sure.
How do you see lament and a theology of suffering fitting with the victory of the gospel, the hope of the gospel, and what we read in the New Testament?
That's good. That's good. So I have a friend who, I think it's published now, she did her dissertations on lament in the New Testament. and recognizing that lament didn't end with the Old Testament, that it really did spill over into the New Testament. And oftentimes when Jesus quotes Scripture, he'll quote from the lament Psalms. And clearly, what he says on the cross are clearly lament words of lament. So I wouldn't quite make that, and I know that's not what you're doing, but I would, say it's not that clear. The Old Testament is lament and the New Testament is triumph and victory. A part of it, I think, maybe goes to my kind of old evangelical fundamentalist Sunday school teachings, which taught me that if you want to lead a person to Christ, you have to convince them of their sin, right? You have to point out, you have sinned in your life, and that's my old evangelical upbringing. Part of our salvation is the acknowledgement of human sinfulness. So my concern is we got to the triumph and the resurrection without going through the cross. We got to the ascension, the victory, without going through the pain and suffering. And that's where both are needed. So the illustration that I've often used in the theology of celebration and suffering, and again, I allude to it in this book, but I have it more robustly laid out in my next evangelicalism book. Think of the theology of celebration as someone who lives in the richest neighborhood in the United States. 17-year-old girl lives in the richest neighborhood. You go to her and you ask her, what do you think heaven is going to be like? And she'll give you characteristics of heaven that reflect the abundance of what she already has. So for a 17-year-old in the richest neighborhood, heaven is not a Dell desktop, it's a Mac Airbook. Heaven is not a small TV, it's a 70-inch plasma with satellite hookup. Heaven is not a Toyota Yaris, it is a Lamborghini. Because on earth, there are already good things, and heaven becomes an amplification of that. But ask the same question to a 17-year-old in Darfur, Sudan, or in a Syrian refugee camp in Lebanon. And their answers are very different, because in the mind of that 17-year-old in the refugee camp, heaven is nothing like the world they live in. There is food and water. There is, her parents aren't dead. Her life is not in danger every day. It's nothing like the world she lives in. So compare that, the celebration and suffering. They're both 17 years old. They're both, followers of Jesus. Let's call it that. But they have radically different views on how the world works. So do we say, and this is what we've done, the person in celebration who has this abundance of good things, she's right. She's got it all, and therefore she should go to these poor places and dump her resources, maybe, fill a shoebox full of them, and then send it over to the poor person. So what we're doing then is we are creating this really imbalanced understanding of what is superior, that the narrative of triumph is superior to the narrative of suffering. But if you think about it Christologically, that also is not true, right? So just doing celebration is like just knowing the resurrection but not the cross, right? And hey, evangelicals, we can't ignore the cross. That's at the root of our conviction. We preach Christ and Christ crucified, so we can't ignore the cross. But is that what we're doing when we're talking about, yes, there will be a great moment when there's triumph and victory for the church and for God's people, but along the way we also have to understand that there are those who are not quite there yet. Yeah. So that's where the suffering and celebration has to be placed in balance. If we want a complete picture of heaven, we need both 17-year-olds' account of heaven. If we want a complete picture of who Jesus is, we need both the resurrection and the crucifixion. And so, can we get to the resurrection without the crucifixion? Can we get to our salvation without the acknowledgement of sin? Can we get to the triumph of the church without lament? I don't think we can.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I have two questions. One's a little lighter. In one part, you said you met a presidential candidate, and we're just wondering who it was.
I've met two.
Okay.
The first was actually three if you count primaries. I met Mario Cuomo in my freshman year in college, and he was not quite a candidate at that time. He actually, did he actually announce? But he was the governor of New York, and he came to Columbia to do a session, and I went really early, and I snuck into the lounge that they had sealed off, and I sat right in front of him, so I could be as close to him as possible. The second was actually more interesting, was John Kerry. I met John Kerry, he's the governor of Massachusetts. I also met Ted Kennedy at a different function, and Ted Kennedy also ran for president, but I met John Kerry. This was right as he was getting ready to launch his campaign. I was working with an at-risk youth ministry called 10-Point Coalition, and the leader of that one of the leaders was a guy named Eugene Rivers, who actually still shows up on MSNBC once in a while. He was one of my mentors, very active in urban ministry. He was on the cover of Newsweek many years ago, Christianity Today, for his gang intervention work, African-American pastor in Boston. And Eugene had some connection to Kerry's office because they had been supporting his work for gang intervention. And so to help kind of create buzz for his campaign, we were at a Baker House meeting talking about gang intervention. Kerry shows up with a whole camera crew and films his interaction with black pastors, and I happened to be there as the Asian guy in that mix. So that's my brush with greatness story.
Okay, and then in one part you're talking about the idea of Han or Han, I don't know how to say it, as the shame that victims feel. I like that idea, and I like get how that plays into lamenting. How do you lament then for a people or a person who, like in your eyes, largely contributed to their own suffering, or they don't necessarily have as large of the Han idea?
Yeah, that's a great question. If I were to go back and do like another take at this book, I would expand that section on Han. I feel like I kind of alluded to it, and I just feel like we could do a lot more with it. And some of you are aware of the kind of the Twitter, Facebook hashtag, the Me Too. That was just crushing. I mean, for me as a former pastor, to see members of my congregation who, and that was about as the epitome of Han as you can get. The deep, profound pain. And can you describe these individuals as sinners who committed sin? Absolutely not. That goes against everything about the gospel to say these individuals who are victims of sexual sin are sinners. No, they are victims of sin, and they've experienced a profound sense of harm. And so I think we do need to go deeper into that reality, because we tend to, again, write theology from the privileged position, which is why we talk more about sin.
We're pretty close to our time, so maybe if we could just have one more question.
And I'll talk faster.
You were in line first.
You were in line first.
I really don't like talking in front of people, so I was really hoping you should take that one. All right. This is just a question that I've kind of been mulling over, and so hopefully you can give me some perspective.
Go for it.
But lament appears to require a fundamental aspect of listening and sharing in the suffering of marginal groups. And so I guess just practically, how do we create space for storytelling and leadership by marginalized people without it feeling forced or tokenism?
Yeah.
Or does that even matter? Is it kind of like a fake it till you make it thing? It always starts out
That
awkward,
too.
but it'll get there.
Yeah. That was a great question and said well. I mean, it was for someone who doesn't like to speak in public, that was brilliant. I mean, it takes work. I think that's why sometimes it's so hard to have some of these conversations on race. It takes work to prioritize the marginalized voices. And I can say, as having been the token Asian in a lot of these kind of places, that it does get a little tiring after a while to be the token Asian quite frequently. What I've been thinking through is, what does it mean for my story to change the narrative of American Christianity rather than just be a blip on the radar, right? So I use this story often about when I go to larger evangelical churches or evangelical denominations or seminaries or Christian colleges, there's usually the one of, right? There's the one black professor, there's the one Asian professor, or I go to mega churches with the one black staff member or the one Asian staff member. And I call that the magic minority syndrome, because that one black person, by virtue of his identity, can conjure up other black people by waving his arms. It's a magical gift that the minority has. That's kind of the ultimate in tokenism, to be told you were here to conjure up other minorities, instead of you actually have an extraordinarily gift and value that you bring of who you are, what you know, and what you've lived. So it's that movement away from tokenism is extraordinarily challenging, mainly because we kind of cap it at a particular point and say the one of is all that we're going to need. I call it the Francis Chanization of Asian American Christianity, which is, every conference that needs an Asian representative, Francis Chan will be there. And I love Francis Chan. He's great. I'm not saying he's bad. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the ability to take that one and then trot that person out over and over and over and over again as the representative of the people group. And that's where our racial discourse has to go much deeper than that. And that's where when a particular individual echoes the dominant culture's theology and ecclesiology, then that person will come out over and over again, brought out over and over again. But what are the diverse voices even within our communities? Diverse voices within the African American community, diverse voices within the Asian American communities. But I think in order to do that, there has to be a change in the mindset, that lament is not just a one-off event. Lament is not just, let's get the one person in to tell their sad story and then move on. It has to be an ongoing discipline. So if it's an ongoing discipline, then you can't have the same lament every time. You need other voices to come into that conversation. And that's why I'm advocating for lament as an ongoing discipline.
Well, thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking Dr. Raw for the discussion.